Great Expectations is one of Dickens's most popular novels. Perhaps only Oliver Twist and David Copperfield are equally well known and well regarded among his full-length novels. Great Expectations is a famous example of the Bildungsroman, a German term meaning literally education novel, which describes novels about a character's passage from childhood to young adulthood. Philip Pirrip, known as Pip, is an orphan who has been raised by his elder sister and her husband, Joe Gargery. Joe is a blacksmith, and a kind friend to the young Pip. In the novel's atmospheric opening chapter, Pip is in the local graveyard on the Kent marshes when an escaped convict named Abel Magwitch approaches him and demands that Pip help him. A terrified Pip agrees, and returns home to get Magwitch some food and a file so he can remove his leg iron. The next day, Christmas Day, soldiers arrive searching for Magwitch and another convict who escaped with him, with whom Magwitch had been fighting on the marshes. They ask Joe to accompany them, since as a blacksmith he can help to resecure the convicts' fetters when they are recaptured. When Magwitch is hunted down and taken back to the convict ship, he tells the soldiers he stole his food from the Gargery home, to save Pip from his sister and the authorities. A short while after this, the reclusive Miss Havisham, who owns the large Satis House, starts to invite Pip round to play with her young ward, a girl named Estella. Miss Havisham has worn the same wedding dress for years, ever since she was jilted at the altar by her husband-to-be. The clocks have been stopped in her house at the moment he jilted her, and the remains of the wedding feast are still rotting and putrefying. Miss Havisham has trained and conditioned Estella to be a heartbreaker. Through her young ward, she intends to exact revenge upon all men for what her betrothed did to her. A lawyer named Jaggers informs Pip that an anonymous benefactor is providing Pip with the money for him to become a gentleman with great expectations. Pip leaves Joe and the blacksmith's forge behind and heads for London, where he meets new friends, such as Herbert Pocket, and a few adversaries, the bullying Bentley Drummle. All this time, Pip is convinced that Miss Havisham is his mysterious benefactor. When Pip's sister dies and he returns to Kent for the funeral, he realizes that he has become a snob who looks down on Joe for being uncouth and illiterate. Pip continues to try to woo Estella, but she remains cold and indifferent to him, and seems more interested in Bentley Drummle. Then, one night, Pip receives a visit from none other than Magwitch, who had been transported to Australia after he was recaptured on the Kent marshes years ago. He has come back to see Pip, and reveals that he is his mysterious benefactor. Having made himself rich in Australia, he wanted to repay Pip for the kindness he showed him all those years before. Pip also learns that the other convict Magwitch had been fighting with back on the marshes, Compeyson, was the man who jilted Miss Havisham, and ran off with a large sum of her money. Compeyson is chasing Magwitch, and Pip agrees to help him, again. Meanwhile, Miss Havisham dies in a fire at Satis House, having learned that Estella has married Bentley Drummle, who mistreats her. As if these aren't enough twists and turns, Pip then learns that Magwitch is Estella's father. He had a fling with Jaggers' housekeeper years ago, but assumed the child died in infancy. Pip agrees to take Magwitch to safety on the continent, but as they are escaping on the river, the police intervene, with Compeyson in attendance. Compeyson and Magwitch fight and Compeyson drowns. Magwitch is gravely injured and dies, but not before Pip has told him that his daughter survived. Pip then falls ill following this series of traumatic events, but the ever-faithful Joe comes to London to nurse him back to health. When Joe leaves as Pip is feeling better, Pip follows him and asks for his forgiveness. Pip has remembered who he is, and where he came from. He becomes a clerk in Herbert Pocket's company, and achieves some level of success. Some years later, he meets Estella at the now-demolished Satis House. Bentley Drummle, her brutish husband, has died, having wasted most of Miss Havisham's money that was left to Estella. She, too, is contrite for how she has behaved. The novel famously ends on an ambiguous note, with Dickens leaving open the possibility that Pip and Estella eventually get married after all. Great Expectations is a novel about growing up, and Dickens deftly weaves a number of elements together with Pip's own troubled journey towards adulthood, such as Joe Gargery's childlike innocence, which is both touching but also all too limiting, and Estella's own grooming or conditioning at the hands of Miss Havisham, who is determined to turn her young ward into a younger version of Miss Havisham herself, so she can wreak vengeance on all men through her. Even the stopped clocks at Satis House reflect the arrested development of many of the novel's characters. In Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, everything is connected. As plots and subplots converge and hidden relations are revealed, the novel elaborates a view of society in which no individual may be considered the master of his or her own fortunes, or expectations, in the old-fashioned sense, meaning one's future prospects. Great Expectations blends literary styles and genres too. It fuses elements of the Gothic with comic satire, realism, fairy tale, crime fiction and melodrama. It can even be read as autobiographical, insofar as Dickens drew on aspects of his upbringing when depicting the deprived childhood of the young orphan Pip, the novel's protagonist and narrator. The reclusive corpse bride Miss Havisham is Great Expectations' best-known figure. Miss Havisham stopped the clocks on the day she was jilted by her fiancé and still dresses in her old wedding gown. She lives shut up in a rotting mansion, where she trains her beautiful ward Estella to enact her revenge upon men. The muscles in Miss Havisham's thin arms swell with vehemence when she draws Pip close and commands him to love Estella, repeating the words "love her, love her, love her" until they sound like a curse. Pip's motivations are mixed. He confides in his childhood friend Biddy that Estella has made him feel coarse and common, adding, "I admire her dreadfully and I want to be a gentleman on her account." After a pause, Biddy asks, "Do you want to be a gentleman, to spite her or to gain her over?" Pip is stumped, but his wish comes true when he is plucked from his low station as a blacksmith's apprentice to be educated as a London gentleman by a mysterious benefactor. The novel's use of first-person narration also affords greater psychological depth than may be found in some earlier Dickens novels, where the emphasis tends to be on human variety more than human complexity. The gap between Pip's youthful impressions and his mature judgment can be especially revealing. It sometimes highlights the unreliability of memory. At other times, it conjures past events with an immersive intensity that illustrates their hold upon the present. The novel's imagery and the characters' motivations often make it difficult to separate past and present, life and death, dream and reality, conscious and unconscious, black and white, even love and hate. But the first-person narration ensures that Dickens' wordy descriptions are never gratuitous. The details Pip notices all contribute to our understanding of his state of mind. Complex patterns of imagery imbue seemingly trivial details with larger symbolic significance. The cold-blooded Jaggers serves as an intermediary between society's lowest and uppermost orders, but his wealth derives primarily from a criminal underclass. The death masks of hanged former clients gaze down from his shelves. Jaggers allows Pip to believe that Miss Havisham is his secret benefactor. But in the most important of the novel's many twists, Pip discovers that his sponsor is the wretched, convict Magwitch, who has grown rich in New South Wales. As a boy, Pip first encounters Magwitch as a man started up from among the graves, on the Kent marshes. The escaped convict demands that the terrified child provide him with food and a file. Magwitch is captured and transported for forgery, but he returns from his live burial down under as a voice from the darkness beneath. He risks death to come back and admire the gentleman he has made. When Magwitch tells Pip, "I lived rough, that you should live smooth," his words evoke the structural dependence of the British ruling classes on the exploitation of oppressed groups at home and abroad. Great Expectations is sometimes described as a novel of formation, a coming-of-age story. But the story of Pip's rise from humble origins to genteel affluence also brings into focus how class identity is formed. It exposes the material underpinnings of elevated social status. In turn, it exposes the arbitrariness of class prejudice. In Making a Gentleman of Pip, Magwitch hopes to infiltrate the ruling class and vicariously beat them at their own game. Pip recoils from his connection to Magwitch, which he believes bars him forever from courting Estella. This proves ironic when Estella's own uncouth origins are revealed. The novel links the convict stain to race, evoking the dispossession and exploitation of racially othered peoples in both Australia and America. As Magwitch tells Pip his Australian story, the smoke of the Negrohead tobacco in his black pipe threatens to perplex the thread of his tale. Pip, in turn, feels enslaved by his dependency on Magwitch. Yet his crippling burden of guilt and debt has more to do with class and colonial entanglements than individual obligation. He comes to see himself not as a free agent, but a mere beam in a vast engine. He longs to have the engine stopped, and his part in it hammered off. Great Expectations' representation of women has divided readers. Some critics see Pip as a masochist, whose brutal upbringing by a much older sister, who boasts of raising him by hand, leads him to associate a woman's love with cruelty. Hence his predilection for the cold, mocking Estella over the caring Biddy. The novel links its depiction of gender to its depictions of race and class. Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe, calls herself a negress slave. Estella has a working-class gypsy mother. Pip's interactions with Miss Havisham also carry a claustrophobic sexual charge, which has been played up or down in the book's many screen adaptations. The punishments meted out to these women as the plot unfolds have been read as symbolic expressions of Pip's repressed violent urges against women. It is the blacksmith Joe who exhibits more traditional maternal qualities. He displays a tender affection for Pip. That Joe can seem childlike in relation to the better-educated boy provides some of the novel's gentlest comic relief. The pleasures of reading Great Expectations are somewhat more complicated. The novel affirms the sentimental ideal of Victorian domesticity that Dickens's earlier novels had been instrumental in shaping. The marriage of Joe and Biddy is followed by the birth of their son, named in Pip's honor, in whom Pip sees myself again. But Pip's romantic fate remains uncertain. The ending of Great Expectations does not satisfy readerly expectations of a romantic union between Pip and Estella. The result is an ambiguous, thought-provoking final chapter that makes far more interesting reading than any neater conclusion would have provided, befitting an unsettling text that retains its haunting power more than 150 years on.